It's about that time we got into that conversation on the IMF, and we're asking the question tonight, does it have a hand in the Finance Bill 2024? Are they exerting pressure? And is that why the Kenya Kwanza administration has been quote-unquote, forced to impose certain tax measures? But before we get into that, on the 11th of June, this is a press statement that was released by the IMF and the Kenyan authorities have reached a staff-level agreement on a set of comprehensive policies and reforms needed to complete the 7th reviews of Kenya's extended fund facility and extended credit facility arrangements and the 2nd review under the resilience and sustainability facility. Let's take a look at some of the observations they made in this press release. Here we go. Refinancing risks associated with the June 2024 Eurobond have dissipated following a successful partial buyback from the proceeds of a new Eurobond issuance in February. It continues to read, despite these positive developments, a significant shortfall in tax revenue collection and deterioration in the primary fiscal balance in the 2023-2024 financial year relative to program targets is expected to keep domestic borrowing needs elevated. As a result, interest payments have increased, putting pressure on public debt, even after the latter benefited from a strengthened shilling. And here we go. It continues to say a sizable and upfront fiscal adjustment in the 2024-2025 financial year will be needed to correct the course. To this end, the authorities have taken decisive steps towards fiscal consolidation by introducing several measures in the context of the draft 2024-25 budget and the 2024 Finance Bill. Lastly, the bill centers on measures to broaden the domestic tax base through rationalization of the various expenditures in line with the recommendations in the medium-term revenue strategy. Prof, I know you have something to say about that medium-term revenue strategy, enhancing tax compliance and increasing the efficiency of expenditures through public expenditure and wage bill reforms, state-owned enterprise restructuring, rationalizing unproductive current spending, and better targeting of subsidies and transfers, while ring-fencing social and development spending will be key to enhancing the credibility of the consolidation strategy in the 2024-2025 financial year and the medium term. I'll start with you, Dr. Abraham Rugo, before we get to the medium-term strategy. Prof. Migai Akech. Dr. Rugo, why does it matter so much what the IMF has to say as to the state of our economy?
Thank you so much, Olive, and it's a pleasure to be here with Migai. One is that to appreciate that IMF, like any other institution, is a lender. But a lender with a difference, because IMF is a multilateral institution in the sense that the money that IMF puts in is money that is collated from different actors. But IMF becomes significant because we have gone to the IMF and requested for financing. This financing is supposed to be one, to help fix any budgetary shortfalls, or secondly is supposed to assure other creditors that we are in good standing, and therefore in that sense they become a lender of choice. Thirdly, IMF is also involved a lot in setting basically the running space, the running context of the central banks across the world. But why is it important in our current context? Is because from 2020 we got into arrangements of what is called the extended credit facility and extended fund facility. This basically is based on what I would consider, we call them the special drawing rights, basically like shares that we have. We are able to ask for certain monies. But then there are certain conditions that we sign against as a country. So IMF, and through their offices, basically through their officials, they do a review, and that's why we are on the 7th review currently. And then we agree And as you have read them, those have to do with from how we will, basically the process we've been calling it fiscal consolidation, which basically is at the center of it. So fiscal consolidation basically means that we are going to do our best as a country to spend either one, to raise our revenues, or to manage our expenditure. What I mean or is, one, you either raise your revenues and reduce your expenditures. The idea is that you want to close the gap between your income and your spending, which has been very, very high, significantly high. But because of the number of conditions, some of which you have just read, and there are quite a number, then they become very significant as opposed to any other lender out there. And therefore, the difference between IMF and any other of the lenders is, first of all, the conditions that affect our governance, affect ours. But it's interesting because that does not then mean that we surrender our autonomy, we surrender the sovereignty of the country.
And that's where Prof would come in. Prof, you did your PhD on structural adjustment programs. But before we get more technical, there's a sense in the country at this point in time that we are bending over backwards to accommodate the IMF. Your thoughts on that?
So it's interesting. So at the time that I was doing my PhD, 2004, the IMF and the World Bank were then imposing conditionalities for the loans that Rugo is talking about, that were called structural adjustment programs. And as developing countries, we then complained and told them, but as Rugo is saying, we are the people that are on the receiving end, but you're not involving us in the making of these decisions. And so those complaints led to some cosmetic changes, if you wish, in terms of how the IMF operates. And now they've come up with what is called the MTRS, the Medium-Term Revenue Strategy. And it's interesting. So let's start with how the IMF itself sees. So first of all, what is the Medium-Term Revenue Strategy? From the IMF's perspective, they see it as a roadmap for tax reform in a country. It's not the tax policy, it's not the national tax policy, but they see it as something that is fitting as a strategy for implementing a national policy, a national tax policy. So the question then becomes, how do we align? And I think the financial industry in this country has been asking, how do you align the MTRS to the national tax policy? But we can talk about that later. So because they are apprehensive of how citizens in the recipient countries will view the MTRS, now they're saying that it is the country's own endeavor leading to a broadly supported, public, transparent tax system reform. Now, ask yourself, when did you hear of the MTRS in this country? Today I tweeted about the MTRS, and when it was taken to Parliament, it was branded secret. Why is it branded secret? And now we go to the questions of governance in financial affairs in this country. Our constitution is very clear that, one, we are sovereign, but our constitution also says, and I think it is important to quote the constitution when we're talking about governance in public finance affairs. It is saying that there shall be openness and accountability, including public participation in financial matters. Where was the public participation in the design of the medium-term revenue strategy? Who participated in it? When you look at the introduction section of the MTRS, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance claims that the people participated, but it's also telling us something very interesting, that the IMF provided support, particularly building capacity and providing technical assistance. So ask yourself, we have experts in the Ministry of Finance, what is this capacity building or technical assistance that they need from the IMF? Because this is a subtle way of the IMF essentially telling them what to do. And then there are subsequent reviews of the MTRS. There was one in April. And if you go to the website of KEPSA, the Kenya Private Sector Alliance, they'll tell you that they participated in a virtual meeting on 17th April of 2024, hosted by the IMF. Shouldn't it, if it is something that is driven by the Ministry of Finance, shouldn't it be hosted by the Ministry of Finance? This is hosted by the IMF to discuss the implementation of the MTRS.
Mm-hmm. Let me get your thoughts on the concerns that are being raised by Professor Migai Akech around the MTRS. Kulikuwa na mkutano nyuma ya tent that you are aware of, or has there been a lack of transparency?
I think one is that the medium-term revenue strategy, which is what we are calling the MTRS. First of all, it was long in making. First, it's important to say that we started with a national tax policy, which got stuck somewhere. Now, what is a national tax policy? National tax policy is basically supposed to give you the overall direction of where we are going with the revenue-raising measures. So that then, first of all, it creates an environment that is predictable, it creates an environment that is certain, so that people can plan, and know that this is the general direction. Then somewhere in there, which is about sometime towards end of the year, sometime mid last year, because it was approved this year, the medium-term revenue strategy pops up, and everybody asks, so what happened to the national tax policy? And there were conversations, there were asks for, but not very openly, because public participation around such conversations has often been very, very minimal. And sometimes quite rushed. There were some conversations of IMF, for instance, inviting different bodies to go. Some of them we did not go because we thought these are things that are supposed to be done by through our parliament, through our national treasury. So there are a couple of meetings in the last 2 years we have stopped attending, and there's a reason why we stopped attending, because we said, look here, this is our country. We come, and this is through the Okoa Uchumi, which Okoa Uchumi campaign that you've heard about. We come, we give input. And this began in 2020, when we will go give input. Then at one point in 2023, we asked, you guys, how do you use our feedback? We are telling you there's a governance problem here. We are telling you there's an expenditure problem here. We are continuing not to spend on critical sectors, but those are you are just pushing, let's tax more, let's collect more tax, let's collect more tax. All these agreements that you make, you're just indicating not done. And therefore, the participation around, especially the tax framework, could have been more open, could have been more transparent in terms of what is the direction. And that's what now you start seeing in the finance bill of last year and this year, and you start asking, where is the direction? What is informing the decisions that are being made? For instance, motor vehicle tax being put in the, in the Income Tax Act. That tells you there is generally no direction per se. So participation could have been much better. Transparency, there is a long way to go there, because these discussions are hush, and before long it's in place. Then you hear it in the cabinet speech that we have passed it. I'm sorry, in the cabinet secretary's speech during our budget, financial year budget for last year, we have passed it, and we are following and we are implementing.
And then they don't even take it to parliament.
It's supposed to be published as a session paper. Mm-hmm. Yeah, given its weight. And of course, as Migai is saying, really, is it down to the national tax policy or the medium-term revenue strategy?
So, Professor Migai Akech, you look at this as a governance issue, this lack of transparency. So why then, if we're going to borrow from the IMF, concessional loans, credit facilities at, how do I put it, without heavy interest payments, as has been talked about by Dr. Abraham Rugo, how do you balance what the IMF is demanding vis-a-vis how this could impact the poorest of your people? Because watu wanalia, as you've seen in the protests. So how do you balance that? You want access to credit that is affordable to finance your development, and your people and IMF has put in place this conditionalities, and your people are saying tutaki kuwa punda, tenor, the debt burden is heavy as it is. So you want to access concessional financing. How do you expect how would you expect as a governance expert the government to balance those two needs?
First of all, the government has to have a very honest conversation with the people, with the citizens. The government is not doing that. The government is not telling us why it is proposing to use our money in certain ways, for example. Why is it so we have 3 offices in this country that you wonder, how is it that we are putting so much money in these unconstitutional offices? The office of the First Lady. Is there any such office in our constitution? The office of the First Lady. The office of the spouse of the Deputy President. Do we have such an office in the constitution? And do you know how much we're proposing to give them? 1.2 billion shillings. We're also proposing that we will repair the house of the Deputy President. And do you know how much money we want you to put into that? 600 million. They're also telling us that there's some confidential expenditure of some 800 million shillings. So if you cannot have an honest conversation with your citizens in terms of how you're going to use their money, you're borrowing on behalf of your citizens, you're not telling them how much you've borrowed, and what you have used to benefit the public from using that money. If you cannot have that conversation, how then do you go back to the people and tell them that we're going to tax you more? How? It doesn't add up. And so we must start from the starting point has to be recognizing that the people are sovereign. There is a hang-up that this government has from the past. They've not moved to the era of the Constitution of 2010, which clearly says that it is the people that are sovereign, and the people can exercise their power directly or indirectly. And in financial affairs, we have said that in very significant respects, we are going to exercise that power directly, which is why the people must be heard when it comes to the budget-making process. And they have options. This is not the end of it. There are options in terms of what we can do. We can recall the MPs that are not doing what we are telling them to do, and they don't have a choice because it is direct participation. They don't have a choice. Once we have told them that, look, you cannot put our money in this or the other, they cannot do it. They cannot come back and tell us that, we are the MPs. And what they are forgetting is that they no longer have the initiative. It is the citizen that has the initiative. It is the citizen that determines how his or her money is used.
All right. So you talk about the citizen is sovereign.
Yes.
But you talk about something else. You're saying, yes, so IMF has imposed these conditionalities. How bound is the Kenyan government to them?
I think as long as you're getting money from them, you're bound to them. Because it's the same as where you go to the bank and you have certain conditions that you have given that you will have to honor when you take a loan. But remember, these are loans we are taking. And the loans are more or less meant to, to facilitate certain activities, certain engagements that we are doing. Because as I was telling you, IMF is not necessarily the one giving us, the highest amount of money. But the conditions they give are the ones that basically are supposed to create an environment of confidence, to the other lenders, to the World Banks and, to the different players. In fact, I was just looking at here, when you look at how much IMF has given to us as of stock at the end of January 2024, you're talking of just about 431 billion compared to an institution like the, IDA, which is basically the World Bank at 1.8 trillion. In other words, what that tells you is that, it's a whole list of, and that's why they have all these reviews basically just to be able to say these guys are safe and all that. But because we have signed and agreed The report says staff level agreement. So this is negotiations they do, and they do them here in town, here in Nairobi. They come, they meet the treasury officials, they meet a couple of other officials, then they write a report, and at the end of their mission, then the mission leader publishes the statement, basically of the staff level agreement. Then it goes, and after that is when you see IMF has approved the release of a certain amount of money. That money generally is not necessarily going to any specific projects, but it's just generally budgetary supports conditioned. So, but I think it's important to say that the responsibility to follow through those issues, some of which, to say the truth, let us take an example of state-owned corporations. It's been a matter of review in each of the years. You remember President Uhuru Kenyatta formed a task force to review state-owned corporations. The KenGens, the Kenya Pipeline, and all these. There were about I think 250 of them. The numbers have increased over time. Because and those are supposed to be rationalized so that then they are functioning, because some of them are non-performing, yes, and yet we keep putting in money. Please note that state-owned corporations alone consume about 30% of our budget, because they have transfers to them, in different forms. So reforming them is not necessarily a bad thing. So it's in the IMF agreement, but it's also part of the commitments, that we have made internally, even the budget report. Transparency on what we are spending in projects, value for money. So because we have signed on those agreements, then we are bound to them. And the implications are that if then IMF says, a statement of no confidence, in the sense that we have defaulted with them, it has this spiral effect, especially noting that about 50% of our debt is. But let me speak something more. That the main reason why we find ourselves where we are is that we are highly indebted, both domestically and externally. We are in deep debt. So when you're in deep debt, whoever gives you conditions of rescuing you basically carries the day. In that sense.
So are you saying the government's hands are tied? In
a way, yes. Because of the conditions and the fact that they have agreed to these conditions.
But is it IMF which was sitting at Treasury and then said, okay, impose a motor?
I don't think, and that's why I'm saying I don't think we can sacrifice the autonomy of a country simply saying it's IMF. We also have a responsibility. We have a parliament that has the responsibility of the pass. All these decisions are supposed to be passed by them. We have a national treasury that has all the officials that are supposed. So we cannot, just point a finger on the other side, yet we have our own officials and our own government, that takes this decision for and on behalf of the people of Kenya.
You were saying you want to tell us where it originated.
And for me, it is about agenda control. In terms of proposing tax measures, it should come from us as citizens. It's a conversation that we should have with our government. It's not a conversation that should come from external quarters like the IMF. So the first time I heard of the motor vehicle tax was in the MTRS. And do you know what the MTRS says about it? So they were proposing strategies for boosting revenue collection, along the major tax heads, whether it is income tax, VAT, excise duty, customs. But then they proposed other tax measures, including, the carbon tax and the green, the carbon tax. And then they said, introduce a motor vehicle circulation tax. That is how they looked at it. And what was it in the MTRS? Because it has evolved. If you look at what is in the financial bill, it's different, because now they're talking about a tax on the value of the vehicle. But then they were saying it was to be based on the engine capacity of the vehicle to improve progressivity. Basically, that the bigger the vehicle, the more the tax. But and so you're asking yourself, was this generated by us as the citizens of this country, or somebody somewhere say that, but in other MTR, because the IMF, this is an IMF approach. So they recommend, every time they go to a country, they'll recommend that the country has an MTRS. So was this a cut and paste somewhere? Somebody said, but in country X we have a motor vehicle circulation tax. Why can't we recommend it to Kenya? And then they come with their technical assistance and capacity building, and they tell the mandarins of the Treasury. And then you have the principal secretary of Treasury coming to your studio. You're asking him, but what is this tax? And he cannot explain it.
But okay, Professor Migaya Ketch. All right, then, we keeping told that President William Ruto has traveled abroad to push for a reform of the international financial architecture. I was looking at the Mo Ibrahim report recently released on financing Africa, and some of the recommendations they make is that IMF should do away with, there should be more representation on these bodies, the Bretton Woods institutions, and then there are what are they called? Starts with an S. Why is this? No. Let me just check my notes here. One quick second. As I look that up, basically, they make this raft of measures. I mean, this recommendations, for example, as human rights organizations, such Oko Uchumi is an umbrella body of different organizations pushing for reform in this sector. A balance between tax revenue collectioners, but not so much that it oppresses the commoner. So a raft of reforms have been recommended. Are these, in your view, worth President William Ruto's time pushing for internationally?
I think you can, and I think it's commendable that African countries are pushing for reforms of these international facilities and institutions, representation, how much you access. But Olive, my concern is that when it comes where the rubber meets the road...
Surcharges.
Yes, surcharges.
Yes.
Where the rubber meets the road is not so much on that process. Is when the money finally arrives here, assuming that all you have is the money you have borrowed, how do you use it? I think the accountability question, is critical. So that I fully support the reform of the international financial institution. System is skewed against Africa. That's for a fact. And I think through our Oko Uchumi, through other institutions, there's a lot of work that is ongoing there. But let's remember that in Kenya, in the coming financial year, if all goes well, we are planning to spend about 3.9 trillion or 390 shillings. Of that, we are hoping to raise 330 out of our own taxes. So the only amount we are borrowing is 60 shillings. So therefore, that means that a big portion of our public services is funded by the people of Kenya. And that's where the discussion should be. So I think we shouldn't be blinded by these international conversations. Yet the bigger problem, which is what is pushing many Kenyans, into pushing, into demonstrating, into protesting, is that we are not prudently using our public funds. And the percentages, as I told you, I've just given you that example of 330 shillings is what we plan to collect from our own taxes. And therefore, the question of prudence, that one you cannot blame it on the international financial system. The problem of distributing, fake fertilizer, you cannot blame that. The problem of not having drugs in hospitals, you cannot blame that. The problem of sending capitation late for schools, you cannot blame that on international institutions. So I think there is a place for that. But the bigger issue, let me give you another example. Whereas in the international financial systems and the borrowing that we do out there, I think the highest we have had is the latest Eurobond that we borrowed to pay the former Eurobond at 11%. Our borrowing locally to the domestic market is 18%. And therefore, we are in bigger danger, and it's important for Kenyans to appreciate this, we are in bigger danger domestically because of our high interest rate than even externally. Externally is only forex shocks. When the forex, like when the Kenya shilling was losing against the dollar. But the interest rates are slightly on the lower side. So let's have the conversation in perspective that as we push for the transformation of the international financial systems, let us also investing in manufacturing, investing in agriculture. Those are decisions of here and now. Dealing with corruption. And runaway abuse of public office. Those are not.
Budgeted corruption at that.
Professor Migaya Ketch, have the last word on this. Africa is pushing for, as Dr. Rugo has stated, and the S word has come, surcharges. So some of the recommendations are suspension of surcharges, talks of punishing conditionalities, increased representation, faster and fairer restructuring processes, and lending in local currencies. So there's already this push. Is that sufficient?
I don't think it is, because I completely agree with Rugo. We have to put our house in order. There has to be better financial governance. But also, if you look at it internationally, unless Africa is speaking with one voice, I mean, President Ruto, Kenya is such a small country.
No, but we were sitting attending G7 meetings.
In the
Prof,
international...
who are you calling?
It's not going to make any impact howsoever. I don't think it will. I mean, you're better off going through the African Union and getting the African states to speak with one voice. If you go as a little country called Kenya, I don't think you will get any far.
All right, I want to thank you. One last thing. Yeah.
One last thing. I think as we continue with this discussion, I have two things to say. One, to the government of the day, listen to the people of Kenya. They are the people that you are meant to provide public services to. They are also the people who are paying these taxes. Two, taxes and revenue in this country is not the problem. Our problem is how we are spending those taxes. And finally, and to the young people of this country, I think we have to keep pushing for a better country. We cannot stop. Thank you.
All right.
Can I say something?
In 30 seconds or less.
Yes. You know Jean-Jacques Rousseau?
No,
he said, the French philosopher, one of the fathers of democracy, if you wish, he said that the moment that a people gives itself representatives, it is no longer free. And you can clearly see that it demonstrated with the way that our members of parliament think that they control the agenda, not the people. And I am glad that Gen Z are rising up and reminding them that it is the people that should control the agenda. And that is why we must have direct participation in financial affairs, including the making of the bill.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Migai Ketch, and he is an inaugurated professor of law. He was explaining the distinction to me today. We also have Dr. Abraham Rugo, who is country manager, IBP Kenya, International Budget Partnerships Kenya. We take a break. The conversation continues online. It went off the streets today to social media, and so it continues online. We take a break. Coming up on the other side is that interview I sat down with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and he spoke about the plan to include refugees in the local communities in Turkana and Garissa.